It wasn't the shouting that stayed with me, it was the sentence. We had been together for just under a year when the first real fight hit us like a cracking glass. Something about who forgot what, something petty. I don't even remember the topic. But I remember how his voice shifted, from frustrated to cold, from lover to judge. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "You'll never be more than my wife." Like that was a leash I should be proud to wear. Like I hadn't walked into the boardroom before I ever walked down the aisle. I froze. Not because it hurt, but because of the silence that followed, like he genuinely believed he'd put me in my place. That was the moment the illusion broke. Not of love, necessarily, but of alignment. I realized then he hadn't married a partner. He thought he had hired an accessory. And worse, he had no idea who I really was, or what I already owned. Not just metaphorically, but legally. I sat down, hands still, heart steady. I could have said 100 things right then. Could have shouted back, thrown something, made it a scene. But instead, I smiled. Because when someone shows you exactly how small they think you are, it's not the time to explain yourself. It's the time to listen. And to start planning. The quietest revolution possible, the kind where you don't scream. You sign papers. I remember sitting at the edge of the couch that night, the weight of his words still suspended in the air like a chandelier waiting to crash. He had already moved on, flipping channels like nothing had happened. That was his way, treating cuts like dust, easily brushed off. But I didn't move. I just watched him. Not with anger, but with a curiosity I hadn't felt in a long time. Who was this man who slept beside me every night, who kissed my forehead before meetings, yet saw me only as someone beside his life, not within it? I realized, painfully, that love hadn't blinded me. It had quieted me, dimmed me, made me bite my tongue so often it felt like part of breathing. But not tonight. Tonight, I let the silence settle until it hardened into a kind of resolve. He didn't know. He didn't know about the company shares. He didn't know that long before he put a ring on my finger, I had sat in investor meetings, had signed equity deals, had taken risks that scared me senseless but led to dividends. He didn't know that I still received quarterly reports he never bothered to read. Maybe he assumed I was just copied for politeness. Maybe he thought I'd forgotten. But I hadn't. I had simply chosen peace. And maybe that was my mistake, confusing peace with silence, love with shrinkage. That night, I made myself a quiet promise. Never again would I let anyone measure me by the size of their comfort. The next morning, he kissed my cheek like nothing had happened, heading off to work in his usual tailored suit and confident stride. I smiled back, not because I had forgiven or forgotten, but because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't the same woman he came home to yesterday. After he left, I walked over to the filing cabinet in the guest room. It had gathered dust, not because I didn't care, but because I had been trying so hard to belong in this marriage that I'd started leaving pieces of myself untouched. I pulled out the thick envelope labeled Founding Agreement, Astor and Blake Ventures. My signature stared back at me, crisp, proud, untouched by the idea of just. That company had been my world once. I had taken the risk of investing early, when it was still an idea on a napkin. And while his face ended up on the magazine covers, my name stayed tucked into the legal bones of it all. 40%. Not as a gift, not as a handout, but as a rightful co-creator. And yet, he never asked. Never even wondered why I stayed so calm when things got hard. I suppose he thought love made me quiet. But it wasn't love. It was restraint. And now, that restraint was gone. I slid the envelope back into place, locked the drawer, and stood a little taller. If he wanted to know who I really was, he'd have to do more than look. He'd have to reckon with me. I started showing up differently, not with fire, but with focus. I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore, I was documenting everything. Every passive comment, every dismissal disguised as a joke, every time he introduced me as the wife while he took credit for decisions I'd helped build. I didn't confront him. I let him speak. I watched the way he lit up in meetings, never questioning why the board nodded when I entered the room, or why our legal counsel always greeted me with an extra moment of eye contact. He thought it was respect by association, not realizing it had been earned long before his first client handshake. At dinner, I let him monologue about expansion plans I had quietly approved 3 quarters ago. I even nodded. Because when someone shows you their version of reality, sometimes the wisest thing you can do is let them live in it until the truth becomes undeniable. But behind the scenes, I was making calls. Meeting with the firm's CFO. Reconfirming my shares, my voting power, my protections. I wasn't planning a coup, I was preparing a reminder. A gentle but irreversible shift in gravity. Because some people don't hear words, they feel consequence. And the next time he tried to define me by what I meant to him, I'd show him who I was, with or without his sentence. Not as revenge, but as realignment. Sometimes, the loudest correction is the quiet return to yourself. We attended a gala a few weeks later, one of those glittering corporate events where power and wealth danced in tuxedos. He walked ahead of me, as always, shaking hands, smiling wide, assuming the spotlight was his by default. I let him have it. Until a board member approached us with a warm smile and said, "You still keeping this guy in check?" I laughed softly, playing along. My husband looked puzzled, but brushed it off. What he didn't know was that half the room had seen me long before they ever met him. I wasn't just the plus one. I had mentored 3 of the CEOs in that room, advised on mergers he couldn't even explain in full, and had sat in on calls that decided whether companies survived or disappeared. But he only saw what he chose to see, and I let him keep looking in the mirror he'd polished himself. Later that night, he gave a speech, thanked a few key names, and ended with, and of course, my wife, for always supporting me from the sidelines. Sidelines. The word landed like a spark on dry grass. A few people glanced at me, some awkward, some curious. I smiled and raised my glass, never breaking eye contact with him. That word, sidelines, echoed louder than any insult. But I didn't flinch. Because the thing about underestimation is, it creates space. And I had been using every inch of that space to prepare. Soon, it wouldn't be about words anymore. It would be about ownership. Back home, I opened the antique jewelry box my grandmother left me. Inside, beneath the velvet lining, were not rings or pearls, but copies of every signed agreement tied to the company's foundation. She had taught me early, never forget the papers. They speak even when you're not in the room. I traced the ink, the dates, the clauses we fought to include, the ones that protected minority stakeholders, the ones that secured veto power when necessary. I had been 27 when I co-founded that company. 27 and terrified. And yet, here I was, sitting in a marriage where the man who benefited from those very contracts believed I was only a wife. It was almost poetic. Almost tragic. I placed the documents into a new folder, one I labeled plainly with my own name. Not his. Not ours. Mine. Then I stood at the mirror. Not for vanity, but to remember. To see the lines that had formed not from fragility, but from holding too much in for too long. I wasn't angry. I was awake. And the woman in that reflection wasn't someone looking for validation anymore. She was someone remembering how powerful she had always been. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to confront. All I needed to do was be ready. Because the next time someone tried to define me by their limited lens, I wouldn't explain. I'd let my decisions speak, and this time, they would be impossible to ignore. The shift began with a board meeting he thought I wasn't attending. It was a quarterly update, standard, routine, predictable. He walked in confidently, shook hands, laughed too loud. But when I entered moments later, briefcase in hand and chair already reserved, his face stiffened. "You're here?" he asked, halfway between curiosity and discomfort. "Of course," I answered, taking my seat without looking at him. The others nodded at me, not in surprise, but in recognition. During the presentation, he mentioned new projections, strategic partnerships, and a bold plan for expansion. He spoke like a man who owned the floor. But then a question arose about the legality of a pending acquisition. He hesitated, gave a vague answer. And before anyone could move on, I cleared my throat. Calmly, precisely, I explained the oversight, cited the clause, and referenced the exact page number in the original agreement. The room turned to me. Some smiled. Others nodded slowly. He said nothing. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. I had removed any doubt without ever raising my voice. Afterward, one of the partners patted him on the back and said jokingly, "Good thing you married her, huh?" He laughed. But his eyes didn't. That was the beginning of the unraveling, not of our marriage, but of the illusion he had built. That he was the sun, and I only reflected light. He had mistaken stillness for orbit. And now, he was starting to feel the gravity shift. He became restless after that meeting. Subtle at first, longer hours at work, less eye contact at home. Quick questions like "Where are you going?" asked too casually to be innocent. He was used to being the center of knowledge, the one with answers, the one holding the keys. But now, he was beginning to realize there were entire rooms in our lives he'd never noticed, because he never bothered to ask if I had the keys too. One night, I found him in his office staring at a folder that had my name on it, legal. Paperwork I had authorized to be reviewed by the firm's internal counsel. "What is this?" he asked, voice sharp, eyes unsure. "Due diligence," I answered, placing my coffee gently on the table. "We're expanding, remember?" He blinked. The tone was calm, but I could see the storm building behind his silence. What he wanted to ask, what he feared to say, was whether I was planning something. But the truth is, I already had. Long before our first fight. Long before he ever said, "You'll never be more than my wife." I had protected myself. Quietly. Legally. Intelligently. Because love doesn't require blindness. And partnership, true partnership, isn't built on assumptions of superiority. I watched him try to process the realization that he didn't fully know the woman across from him. And I didn't offer comfort. Not this time. Because some truths are meant to be sat with, not softened. That weekend, we went to dinner with friends, the kind of group that had known us from the early days. Back when we both had big dreams but little to show. They laughed, they drank, and at one point, someone toasted to the couple that built an empire. I smiled. He did too, but this time it was different. There was a hesitance in his eyes. A weight behind the grin. Later, in the car, he was quiet, too quiet. I asked if everything was okay, and he said, Do you think I've been unfair to you? The question floated between us, strange and heavy, as if he had finally heard his own echo for the first time. I didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because the answer wasn't simple, and I didn't owe it to him in that moment. He had lived in a story where he was the sole author. Now, he was realizing I had written chapters too, ones he never read. When we got home, he stood in the doorway a little longer than usual, as if trying to remember something he'd forgotten. 4 years. And I went upstairs, slowly, deliberately, feeling no rush to explain myself. That's what power feels like when it's not about domination, but about dignity, a quiet return to balance. He could keep asking questions. I didn't mind. Because this time, I knew exactly who I was. And I wasn't waiting for permission to live from that place anymore. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. A few weeks later, I received the finalized quarterly earnings report. Our valuation had nearly doubled, and a private investor had offered to buy a minority stake, but only if I remained on the board. Not us. Me. My name in writing. I didn't gloat. I didn't even bring it up at dinner. Instead, I filed the offer away, knowing exactly what it meant. He, on the other hand, had been distracted. Trying harder to prove himself, dressing sharper, being overly affectionate in public. At first, I wondered if he was changing. But the truth became clear, he was adjusting because he felt the shift. And still, he didn't ask what was really happening. One evening, while we were preparing for a charity gala, he asked, "Are you nervous about speaking tomorrow?" I raised an eyebrow. "I'm not speaking," I said. He froze. "They didn't ask you to speak?" I smiled softly. "They asked me to present the award." That was the moment something cracked. Not in him, in the story he had built. The one where I existed in his shadow. He stared at me, searching for words, but there were none. Because I hadn't stolen anything. I hadn't plotted, deceived, or betrayed. I had simply kept growing. Quietly. Consistently. Without asking for permission. And now, the spotlight was mine, not as a surprise, but as a reflection of everything I had always carried in silence. The night of the gala arrived like a storm disguised in silk. I wore a deep emerald dress, one my grandmother had once described as a color that never begs to be seen, but is never forgotten. As we entered the venue, cameras flashed, names were announced, and hands were shaken. But something was different. People addressed me first. Journalists asked about the foundation I co-founded, not about who I was married to. And when the moment arrived, and I stepped onto that stage to present the award, the silence in the room felt sacred. I spoke not of success, but of resilience. Of women who are underestimated, not because they are weak, but because they are quiet. I saw his face in the crowd, expression unreadable, hands folded tight. Afterward, as we walked to the car, he didn't say much. But just before the door closed behind him, he said, "I didn't know they saw you like that." I looked at him, not with anger, but with something closer to stillness. "They always have," I replied. "You just never asked." That wasn't cruelty, it was truth. And sometimes, truth arrives not as a scream, but as a mirror. In that moment, he finally saw it. Not just the power I carried, but the absence of his awareness. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was simply living in full view, with or without his recognition. Back home, I removed the earrings I had worn on stage, a gift from my grandmother years ago, the kind that held more meaning than sparkle. I placed them gently back into their velvet box, just like I had done countless times before. But this time, it felt different. Not like the end of a performance, but the quiet conclusion of a chapter that had been waiting for closure. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, silent, unsure whether to come in or to leave me in peace. "I guess I've underestimated you," he said finally, almost whispering. I didn't turn around. "You didn't," I replied softly. "You just never looked." And with that, I dimmed the lights, not to create distance, but to reclaim stillness. Some people think power is about confrontation. But I've learned it's more often about permission, the permission we give ourselves to no longer explain, to no longer shrink. I wasn't looking for an apology. I wasn't hoping for change. What I wanted, I already had: my own voice, my own equity, my own clarity. As I lay down to sleep, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting to be chosen, appreciated, or finally seen. I had already chosen myself. And no one, not even the man who once said I'd never be more than his wife, could ever take that back from me. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of our lives shifted without announcement. There were no loud arguments, no slammed doors, no dramatic confessions. Just a quiet rebalancing. He began coming home earlier, cooking more often, asking small questions he never used to care about. I answered when I felt like it. Not out of spite, but because I no longer felt the need to fill the silence with explanations. There was a tenderness in his gestures now, but it came too late to rewrite the narrative. I didn't resent him for that. Some people grow faster than others, and some only begin to grow when they lose control. One afternoon, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a framed photo of us from 5 years ago. "Did I ever really know you?" he asked, almost to himself. I poured a cup of tea, placed it beside him, and said nothing. He didn't need an answer. Because deep down, he already knew. He had married a woman thinking she would orbit around him. But she had her own gravity, her own center, her own axis. And that realization, that shift, had undone the illusion he thought was love. I didn't hate him. In fact, I felt something softer, the kind of compassion you offer someone who finally took off the blindfold, even if it was after the storm had passed. Some awakenings come late. But they still arrive. And they still leave something behind. I began walking more. Long walks through the neighborhood, down streets I hadn't noticed before. I wasn't running from anything, I was walking toward myself. There was a calm in those quiet steps, a clarity that didn't demand closure, only presence. I passed the coffee shop where we used to meet after work in the early days, and smiled softly at the memory. Not because I missed it, but because I finally understood it for what it was, a beginning, not a forever. Sometimes love is not a promise, it's a lesson wrapped in warmth. And when its purpose is complete, you don't have to hate it to let it go. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept important papers. I took out the prenup he had never read, the one that protected everything I had built. I didn't hold it with bitterness, I held it with gratitude. It had never been about revenge. It had been about honoring the part of me that always knew. I placed it back without a sound, then looked around the home we shared, and finally saw the truth: I didn't need to leave in anger, or stay in silence. I was already free. Not because he gave me permission, but because I stopped needing it. There is a kind of peace that comes after fire. Not the loud kind. The kind that settles in your chest like a breath you didn't know you were holding. One morning, just as the sun began to press through the curtains, I sat at the window with my coffee and watched the street come alive. A neighbor watered her Plants. A child rode past on a bicycle with one wobbly wheel. Life moved, unchanged by the storms inside any one house. And that's when I understood something simple and profound: not every revolution needs an audience. Some are quiet. Some happen when no one's watching, in the soft decision to stop shrinking, in the gentle refusal to explain your worth. One more time. He came downstairs moments later, rubbing his eyes, hesitant. He sat across from me, wordless. We looked at each other for a long moment. No accusations. No defenses. Just two people who had walked the same road, but finally saw they were headed in different directions. I smiled at him. A small, honest smile. Then I said, "I think I'm ready to move out." He nodded. No fight. No begging. Just a quiet nod and a long breath. And that was enough. Because real freedom isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It's when you leave, not because you're broken, but because you finally remembered. You were whole all along. As I packed later that week, I didn't cry. I didn't doubt. I simply chose myself again. And this time, I knew that choice would echo louder than any words he ever said.